Today I'm here with Candice Alfano, a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of the Sleep Anxiety Center of Houston. So we know that sleep is very important for our health and wellness, and yet many of our teenagers, and I would say parents as well, have a hard time getting the right amount of sleep. So what do we do?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I wish I had a simple answer to that question. Probably the first thing I can do that's important is validate the sleep problems that most people are having. We're experiencing an unprecedented stressors, plural, right now. And sleep is often the first biological system to malfunction when we're stressed. This is partly because of hormonal and underlying biological changes, but also because of the thoughts and the worries that become more prevalent during times of stress, all of the what ifs, which oftentimes creep in at night when we're trying to sleep and it's quiet and we can really focus on our worries. Other challenges right now are loss of routines. Routines are critical for everything we do, in particular our sleep, because they really set the timing of when we do certain things, and they provide certain cues for feeling sleepy, for waking up. But parents are working from home, kids, their school schedules were disrupted. Now they're on summer break. Regularity is something that's gone out the window for most families. And so it can be tempting to just stay up late or to sleep in. But our sleep is regulated by an internal clock, among other things. And that clock functions best when we set it to the same bed and wake times. So one thing that everybody can do, whether you're a teen or an adult or even a young child, is try as much as possible to go to bed and to get up at the same time every day.
So you're a sleep expert. Is that what you do in your own life?
I actually am pretty good. In honesty, I have my periods of stress or chaos, when I'm writing a grant, for example, where, I don't follow that advice. But generally speaking, I do, because I've really learned that it impacts my entire day. It impacts how much energy I have, how long I can focus on a particular task, how good and how patient of a parent I am. So it really is reinforcing once you get yourself on a regular schedule. When you see that, wow, I feel better, I get more done, I'm more patient, my mood is better, it makes you want to keep doing it, hopefully.
Okay, that was a great answer. I put you on the spot. Thank you. So the waking up the same time, going to bed the same time, is that the number one thing you tell people?
So sleep regularity is one of the most important things. Some of the other things that we can fall in the habit of doing that wind up backfiring on us is trying hard to sleep. And that sounds really funny because, if sleep doesn't come easily, of course you would think trying harder would help, except it does the exact opposite. So when we get into bed at night, if you're finding that you're feeling awake, either in your body or in your head, your mind is kind of going through the checklist of things you have to do the next day, or you're just feeling as though sleep isn't going to come, one of the worst things you can do is just lie there and try to force it. Because what that often does is create this negative association between your bed and sleep. Essentially, our bed then cues feeling awake. So if you find that you're in bed for 20, 30 minutes and you just simply can't initiate sleep, a good thing to do is to get out of bed, sit under very dim lighting, and do something that's relatively boring. Read a boring book, or color a picture, or something that's not going to engage you, and something where you're probably going to start to feel sleepy pretty quickly. And then go and get back into bed at that point and try to initiate sleep. Same thing is true in the morning. A lot of us, when that alarm goes off, because we're so tired, we just want to lay there and we want to keep hitting the snooze, or, we want to lay there and just mess about on our phone, even though we're not really sleeping. In fact, that helps to desynchronize, I would say, our sleep schedule and create a harder time that night when you get into bed falling asleep. So it's not just being disciplined at night and getting out of bed when you can't sleep, but when your eyes open in the morning, it's time to get up. Don't lay there for an hour and kind of fall in and out of a very light stage of sleep. It's not doing much to prolong the amount of sleep you're getting. It's not really going to help you feel better during the day. And if anything, it might hurt you.
So we should not be doing work in bed, reading in bed. How about reading? And how about reading before you go to sleep? Like, are those, if you watch TV before you go to sleep, are those also disruptors?
So a lot of people read before bed, and for that reason, it becomes a very potent sleep cue. Meaning that to some extent it signals to our brain and our body that sleep is coming. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to read in bed for a short period of time before sleep. But if you're somebody who likes to lie in bed and read for 2 hours and get into a book that you can't put down, you probably don't want to do that kind of reading in bed. Now, you mentioned electronics, and of course that's a big no-no, particularly in bed. There are a couple of mechanisms through which we think using electronics during that pre-sleep period disrupts sleep. One is that when we're on our phone, we wind up usually getting engaged in something, be it a program or a conversation or just scrolling on Facebook, that makes us stay there much longer than we had intended to. So one way electronics seem to disrupt sleep is simply by displacing them. But another important factor is the light or the wavelengths of light that are emitted from electronic screens. In particular, they emit a lot of blue light, and blue light is associated most closely with making us feel awake, elevating our mood. And so when that happens during the nighttime hours, we're much more likely to find that it's difficult to fall asleep, even when we put that device down. If you do have to be on a computer at night, which many of us do, there are programs you can download that reduce the amount of blue light coming through the screen. There are also really cheap $10 blue blocker glasses that you can get from Walgreens or from the local drugstore, which have been shown actually to be helpful in not pushing our sleep period further.
I thought that at some point the blue light was debunked, that that wasn't really keeping us from sleeping. You're saying that's still a cause.
No, I'll say that the research is inconsistent in that some studies suggest there are larger effects than other studies, but by and large, a majority of studies show that it does impact our circadian rhythm, and that's kind of our internal rhythm that dictates when we fall asleep and when we wake up.
All right, well, so, the thing that's so interesting about all of this is I think there's pretty much a prescription for good sleep, and yet we don't do it. So it's like there's some pull. It's kind of like knowing that you shouldn't eat the ice cream because it's not great for you, or whatever other food you want to eat, and we still do it. So how do we convince our teenagers? They're not easily convinced by best of something, but we see them tired and not at their best. How do we convince them?
You know, what I often tell parents is that if you want to sell them on sleep, you really have to speak their language. So, it doesn't necessarily help to tell them, you'll feel better tomorrow, you won't have trouble waking up. Try to focus on the things that have a lot of meaning to them. So, for example, their appearance is very, very important to them. And there's research to show that when we get inadequate amounts of sleep, we're not as attractive. We're more likely to have a breakout. So we're more likely to have acne. So that's kind of one angle that you can come from. Another is that sleep helps us remember things. It helps us learn. And that's not just important for academics, it's important for social functioning. So it means that they are going to better remember names and interactions and phone numbers and, important social events. Other things that are equally as important is that sleep is incredibly critical for resetting our physical performance. And so our reaction time is slower and our coordination is much worse when we haven't had an adequate amount of sleep. In fact, there's research to show that when somebody's been awake for 19 hours, which in many cases is really the typical work or school day if we've got a lot going on, their performance, that is their coordination and their reaction time, is equivalent to somebody who actually has a legal level of intoxication. And so for our teenagers who are starting to drive, but are novice drivers, they don't have a lot of experience on the road, this is something that is potentially life-saving, getting enough sleep. And so this is something that parents need to take hold of too. If your teen, has gotten a poor night of sleep and they went to bed at 1 a.m. and they had to get up at 6 a.m. for school, and they didn't take a nap when they got home and they want to take the car out that evening, parents should give that a lot of thought, that maybe it's a better idea to drive them or have one of their friends drive. This is a very serious and known risk factor.
I like tying them together without it being punitive, like just the idea that it's not going to be safe, so you can't do it. Are there different tips to your teenager?
If your teenager can't sleep, or if they're waking up in the middle of the night?
Is it the same exact things that you've said already, or is it something different?
Yeah, those principles really apply across all ages. But in our teenagers, what we typically see is something that's different, and it's a function of their underlying biology. So one of the reasons that teenagers are a very high risk group for inadequate sleep. So as a background, on average, our teens need about 9 hours of sleep per night. But national data suggests that about 3/4 of teens don't even get 8 hours a night. It's not entirely their fault. It's not just that they're on their electronic devices or that they're not prioritizing sleep. When puberty hits, there are a lot of changes that happen, and some of them are very well known. We recognize the bodily changes in a teenager that reflect pubertal development. But there are underlying biological changes as well that we don't see, but they're very, very robust in affecting sleep. That circadian rhythm that I mentioned earlier, that kind of internal clock that tells us, when we're ready to sleep, starts to run a little bit slow during the teenage years. So whereas maybe at the age of 10 or 11, your child was a great sleeper and they could get in bed at 9:30 and they were out, now suddenly it's 9:30, 10:30, and it's 11, and they're still awake. And what they're saying to you is, I'm not sleepy. So even if they were to get in bed at 9:30 or 10, they will lie there for a period of time. It's not their fault. Their biology has changed.
School time is the problem, right?
I'm sorry?
School time is the problem. Because if they could go, like that whole movement about starting school later because teenagers aren't going to go to bed early enough to get the amount of sleep they need.
So you bring up a great point, which is that there is a push across the country to start schools later, because currently high school start times, which about half of the high schools in the US right now have a start time of 8 a.m. or earlier, which is completely out of sync with a teenager's biology. There have been a number of studies, and they more or less all show the same thing, that when you start school later, attendance goes up, tardiness goes down, mood improves, grades get better across the board. There was concern, and there's often been pushback from schools saying, well, if we start school later, kids are just going to stay up later, and so it's not really going to have an impact. Well, now we actually have the data to show that that isn't true. That kids actually will go to sleep if they're given a bedtime. They will go to sleep at, say, 11 o'clock, because typically they're not really tired before that. But now they get to sleep, instead of having to get up at 6 for school, they get to sleep till 7. That extra hour is tremendous for a teenager's ability to learn only a few hours later when they're sitting in a classroom.
Okay, last question. Do you know anything for sure about how to fix a bad sleeper?
I know very few things for sure. I should say that. I really would go back to some of the things that I mentioned earlier, that irrespective of what your particular sleep problem is, we know that having a regular sleep schedule, limiting light exposure in the evening prior to sleep, reducing caffeine intake, particularly for teenagers. Parents often don't realize all of the places that caffeine hides, including chocolate. and some sodas that they might think don't have caffeine. But it has a long half-life. And so if a teen is kind of downing a Coke with dinner, that's going to make it even harder for them to fall asleep on time. And then of course, pre-sleep activities. We want to reduce electronic media and screens. We know that they're arousing both in terms of their content and in terms of the blue light they emit. So there are things that everybody can do that will likely benefit them in terms of their sleep.
Dr. Candice Alfano, thank you so much for your great advice.